So this is video 2 for what would be Tuesday, March 21st's notes. We just talked about the Suez Crisis, then we're going to go down to the Eisenhower Doctrine. So the U.S. quickly replaced the British and French as a leading Western influence in the Middle East, but faced growing Soviet influence. In 1957, Eisenhower pledges economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern country threatened by communist takeover. So basically, the Eisenhower Doctrine is essentially the Truman Doctrine, but now it applies directly to the Middle East. So the Truman Doctrine, Eisenhower Doctrine, pretty much the same thing. Eisenhower Doctrine applies to the Middle East, whereas the Truman Doctrine pretty much applied to Europe. So the Soviets had a lot of interest over the oils in different countries like Iran and so forth in the Middle East, and so we wanted to curtail that by saying if any country is threatened by a communist takeover, America is going to intervene here in the Middle East as a result. This was first applied in 1958 when we sent in 14,000 Marines into Lebanon to prevent a civil war that would happen there. So we sent in 14,000 Marines in Lebanon that would prevent a civil war, which could have resulted in a communist takeover if it was allowed to happen. Another important thing is going to be another important development that's going to happen in 1960 is the creation of OPEC. OPEC is this organization that's going to create amongst Arab countries that have a lot of oil. It's going to have a lot more influence later on after it's developed. So in 1960, several Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and then also Venezuela from South America, formed this new organization called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Basically, OPEC decides that they don't want all this Western influence and Western dominance over what they can and can't do with their oil, so they decide to basically form a group together to try to try to sell their oil as a group and try to deal with the Western influence and not be taken advantage of. Because Western culture was depending more on oil, Arab nationalism was rising, which means these countries are becoming stronger, and this whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict only made things worse. And so we're going to see a lot of problems in the future where America is trying to get oil from the Middle East, but because of these Arab countries becoming stronger and becoming more influenced by Islamic law and so forth, and because of our support of Israel, it's going to become a danger to us, as well as it's going to make us harder to be able to trade with these areas too, which we're going to see more of this down the road. But just know that OPEC forms here in 1960 with these Arab countries, and it's going to be an issue down the road. You can see this map right here I have of the various OPEC countries in orange as well. All right, the Soviet relations. In terms of U.S. security, nothing was more critical than our relations with the Soviets in the 50s. And it fluctuated under Eisenhower. So first we had the spirit of Geneva. After Stalin's death in 1953, Eisenhower called for a slowdown in the arms race. And he presented this idea called an Atoms for Peace plan to the United Nations. Atoms being ATOMS. So Eisenhower called for a slowdown in the arms race because no more Stalin. And he presented this idea of a Atoms for Peace plan to the United Nations, basically trying to work towards improving our relationships with nuclear power and so on. The Soviets showed some similar signs. They basically showed that they wanted to also make things less tense in the Cold War, just like we did. So as a result, Soviets withdrew their troops from Austria, and they became more peaceful with Greece and Turkey. So the Soviets withdrew their troops from Austria and became more peaceful with Greece and Turkey. In 1955, Eisenhower went to a summit meeting in Geneva, in Switzerland, with the Soviet leadership. Eisenhower at this Geneva proposed an open skies policy where we'd basically be able to fly spy planes over each other's countries and take photographs of military bases. The Soviets declined this idea. This is important because we offered this to them. They said, no, we don't want to do this, but we basically do it anyway years later, which we'll come back to that later on. But the important part of this is that you have what we call the spirit of Geneva once we leave. That basically in 1955, we show that both our country and the Soviets are willing to work on improving our relationships between our two countries over how we're going to get along. And so it showed that this is what we call the first thaw in the Cold War. And that's the term they use, not me. It's the first thaw in the Cold War, a situation where we're basically trying to make a better relationship between us and the Soviets. And then in 1956, they have a new leader emerge, Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev becomes the new Soviet leader who replaces Stalin officially as the sole leader of the Soviet Union. This is him right here in 1956. And Nikita Khrushchev did a lot to denounce the crimes of Stalin, saying that he was a bad dude. And Nikita Khrushchev said that we should have a peaceful coexistence with the West. So Stalin had said there might be a war someday. Khrushchev says we should have peaceful coexistence with the West and not try to basically eliminate one another. Then you have another event called the Hungarian Revolt here in 1956. Cold War tensions were relaxing after the Geneva situation, but then you had this, the workers in East Germany and Poland demand reforms. And so you start to see some of these, so the Eastern European countries also saw kind of a thaw in the Cold War too, and they wanted to test new leadership. So you see some of these countries begin to have their workers try to protest for better treatment, which won't work out well because Khrushchev is going to still be hardline on these Eastern Europeans. Most famously with the Hungarian Revolt. There was an uprising in Hungary in 1956, and they overthrew the communist government. So these workers in Hungary overthrew their communist government in 1956. And for a brief period of time, they basically installed a democratic government with their workers. So we had a chance to recognize them and help protect them. But America, including Dulles, doesn't do anything in the situation. We basically let this happen because we knew what was coming. Within a week or so, the Soviets send in troops and crush the rebellion. So within about a couple weeks, the Soviets send in troops and crushed this rebellion. America took no action in any of this because we thought even though they overthrew their government, Eisenhower believed that if we intervened here, it would basically cause a war to take place. So why do we care about this then if we didn't do anything with the situation? Because basically it recognizes a de facto sphere of influence the Soviets have in Eastern Europe, even though we never do anything to really get involved here. So Dulles for years have been saying that we should liberate and help intervene in East Europe, and now this shuts them up because we had our chance with Hungary, but we don't do anything about it. So the U.S. gave a de facto recognition of Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe once we didn't do anything in the Hungarian Revolt. And the Soviets cracked down on Hungary, reinstalled a communist government, and made it oppressive again. So this basically ended any kind of thaw in the Cold War. We thought that Khrushchev might let these countries go and do whatever they wanted to, but he shows that no, he's going to keep this protection. He's going to keep this buffer zone and not let these countries break away as a result. All right, so the next thing is going to be Sputnik. Sputnik is a huge deal, a huge change in our policies towards the Soviets and the Cold War and so on. In 1957, the Soviets shocked the U.S. by launching the world's first satellite. So the first man-made satellite goes into space by the Soviets, not by us, in 1957, in October. So America, it gets caught off guard. We were nowhere near doing this yet. We had some rocket development, but most of what we were doing is flying these high-altitude jets. We weren't doing rockets yet. So we were behind. So basically, the Soviets kicked off the space race with Sputnik. Here's a picture of Sputnik right here, with their satellite, and we weren't prepared. We weren't ready for this to happen. And so it caught us off guard, and like, oh crap, we need to start doing more to help ourselves out to get us caught up, or else we're going to lose the space race that's now begun. So the U.S. quickly tried to replicate what they did, but it took us a while to do it. So we're questioning everything now. Are we as good as the Soviets? Are the Soviets better than us now? Have we lost the Cold War? Or are we losing the Cold War now? So after about 4 or 5 months, we finally launched our own satellite into space, but now we're behind the game with what the Soviets are doing. Some blame the schools for inadequate training. So in 1958, Congress passes the National Defense and Education Act to help basically booster our support of certain types of teachings in school. So basically now, they're going to start supporting more science and math. So with the National Defense and Education Act, we begin to push more science and math in schools, and we also push more technology development as well as foreign languages. So the National Defense and Education Act will authorize federal money to be spent for more science technology, math education, foreign language education in basic schools. And I don't mean college, I mean like general, like K through 12 schools. So that's one direct effect. So this space race starts. We're trying to compete now, catch up, which they've already beat us with the first object in space. We create this act to help try to keep up. It creates NASA too, so we also create NASA because the next step is going to be putting a man in space. So now we can't just make rockets. We got to try to start making this plan to put a first man in space. We won't put the first man in space until 61, so we're going to cover that in Unit 12. But that's our next goal too. So NASA's formed to try to catch up and compete with these guys as well too. So the other concern here too is that if they can launch a rocket into space with a satellite, they could also potentially put a nuclear weapon on this rocket and launch it and attack us. So we're also fearful that they might strap a nuclear warhead to these rockets and attack us in the future if we're not careful, which is a very real concern. So this only heightens the Cold War because now, we could be attacked from miles and miles away by a nuclear missile as opposed to being dropped from an actual plane now. So this also increases the arms race in terms of weapons are being more advanced. So Sputnik has a lot of effects here. So when it launches, it starts a space race, which we're behind in. It passes this act, which gives federal money and attention towards science, math, technology, and foreign languages. It creates NASA, and it also creates this fear of being attacked by missiles that may be launched from miles and miles away. So this only makes the Cold War more intense. So that's where we're going to stop. We're going to resume the notes here on Wednesday and pick up from there, and we'll wrap up Unit 11 on Wednesday and Thursday. See you then. Good luck with ACT.